Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at the Denon AH D9200 headphones. These are a closed-back headphone. They're not a particularly well-known headphone, but they're one of those that when you hear it talked about, it's often talked about in positive terms. So when I happened to meet channel viewer Kim at the 2022 Melbourne Hi-Fi show and he offered to lend me his D9200s for a review, I gratefully said yes, and now here we are. So thank you, Kim, for lending me your D9200s, and now let's jump in and talk about how they perform.
You think of me. Walking out that door, never hearing me talk to myself in the morning anymore. Would it all just turn and turn and turn and turn and turn and turn? You don't think about it. Maybe it scares you like it scares me.
The D9200s retail for $1,599 US, and they're a dynamic driver, closed-back headphone with an impedance of 24 ohms and sensitivity of 105 decibels per milliwatt. What that means is they're really easy to drive from pretty much anything. Before we jump in and start talking about the sound, let's talk a bit about the design of these. And I happen to think they're a pretty nice looking unit. They're not a glamorous or spectacular looking design, but they feel really well made. I personally find them quite comfortable, and I also think they look nice. They're not flashy or blingy. The bamboo cups used on these, it is real bamboo. The cups on these don't look particularly special, but I think they're nice. They're understated. I like the silver and the bamboo combo. But that's going to be a very personal thing, of course. Moving beyond the looks, the other things worth knowing is that they're a fairly sleek and compact closeback, which I think is going to be good in many cases. It may influence the sound, as we'll talk about a bit later. But what you've got here is, as I've already said, a bamboo cup. You've got these lovely metal yokes that feel fantastic. They feel well made, they feel sturdy, they're very smooth to the touch, but not kind of boring either. They're an interesting shape and interesting design. You've got this twin rod, ratcheted kind of mechanism for adjustment. A really interesting shaped leather headband, so there's a bit of padding here with the leather over the top. And why I say an interesting shape is that when I first had a look at these, I actually asked Kim if he'd bent them to make them more comfortable. Because in their passive shape here, they've got this really kind of conical bend to them. What that does mean is that when you go to put them on, they kind of flare out and actually become more circular. But it was really interesting. I thought something was maybe wrong when I first looked at them. I thought maybe Kim had to bend them to get more clamp force. But no, this is how they come, and for me at least, it does seem to result in a fairly comfortable listen. I've had no problems with hotspots or discomfort during extended listening. I do always seem to prefer a suspension band, but I've had no problems with this one. Part of that could be the fact that they're fairly light, and so in that sense, I think they're very comfortable. But one area that I think some people might have problems with are the pads, and that's because they're a very shallow pad. Particularly at the front edge, they're a slightly angled pad, and the front edge is very shallow, which means if you've got ears that protrude much, you're probably going to start touching the inside of the driver. Or the inside of the cup, I should say. The driver's protected, of course, but your ears might touch the fabric that covers the inside. So take that one into account, but it does mean that they're not the most comfortable closeback I've worn, but they're certainly a comfortable closeback. One other thing that these pads meant was I had all sorts of trouble trying to get a good, solid seal on my measurement rig. And so I'm not going to try and share a lot of measurements. I'll just show you on screen now that I couldn't for the life of me get the left and the right channels to both seal. And so what you're seeing here is what happens when you break the seal. The good news is that the line that looks better, the one with a nice linear bass and a bit of treble emphasis, that's the one that's actually how they sound. The other one's a sign of what happens when it doesn't seal properly, but I never had that problem on my head. It was just to do with the ears rig. Finally, before I put these down, it's worth mentioning that you get on the bottom of these cups a pair of 3.5mm sockets. So these have a dual 3.5mm entry, which means they can use the same sorts of cables as you might have for a hi-fi headphone, for instance. And the cables you get in the box with the D9200s are quite nice. They've got a nice fabric wrapping, they look and feel fairly premium, and they're actually one of the nicer headphone cables that I've seen coming with a stock headphone. So for those that don't believe in cable upgrades and just want a nice ergonomic cable, you're probably not going to want anything more than what the Denons come with. I haven't got footage of them here because Kim has them all nicely wrapped up. I didn't want to undo that, but I did have a good look at them and they looked and felt fantastic. And so ultimately I'd say that the design and the comfort of these is very good. As I said, they're not the most comfortable headphone I've used in terms of closebacks, but they're certainly not bad so long as you don't need a deep ear pad. And then that of course brings us to the question of how they sound. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. Listening to the D9200s across a bunch of different amplifiers, the first thing I'll mention is that it didn't make a big difference what amp I paired them with. They showed me the qualities of the amp, of course, but it wasn't like they were one of those headphones that transforms with different amps. So everything I'm going to say here is pretty transferable across any system. Starting at the top of the frequency range, and as I've already kind of alluded to, the D9200s have treble that's extended, it's clear and it's detailed, but it is a bit enhanced. So if you're someone that doesn't like a slightly enhanced treble, these might be too much for you. It is well controlled and well managed, but what I found was that it occasionally made the tonality of whatever I was listening to ever so slightly unnatural. And I'll talk more about that at the end here. I've got some specific tracks I've talked through. But that's a key issue for me with the treble from these, is they're just a hair off being completely natural. They're not way off, they're not nasty, but not quite right. Coming down into the mids and vocals, they're clean again, they're quite transparent, the sense that you don't have a lot of coloration over them, but again slightly unnatural, and it's probably because of that treble. The treble just brings a slight emphasis to things like breath and texture in voices. And what I found was that for female vocals, they sounded wonderful, really enjoyable, because you get a good balance of the upper registers of the female vocal along with the breath. But when you go to a deeper male vocal, the breathiness or the texture just overshadows or outweighs a little bit the depth and the resonance of a male voice. And so for me, this is where they're not always the most natural sounding headphone, but it was never a bad listen. It was enjoyable and not at all distracting, but I'm just splitting hairs here to give you the full picture. And I should mention, part of the reason for that is I don't have any good comparisons for this review. I'm currently without a closed-back headphone in this kind of ballpark, and so all I can do is give you as much description and clarity and clarification as I can in lieu of an actual direct A-B comparison. And so moving on now to bass, and the bass from these, in terms of the extension of the bass, is nothing short of excellent. They have this lovely linear, deep extension, so nothing's overly enhanced, nothing's too prominent, but it goes all the way down. That's great for those that want a very natural bass presentation, but it does mean that they're not going to give you a punch or a thump like a tuning that's got any kind of lifts or peaks in the bass area. I personally really like the tuning. I do like a bit more bass than these have, but they never felt like they were lacking bass. And so overall, I'd say that the tonality side of things, the D9200s are really strong. They're not perfect, but for me, it's kind of hard to pick holes in them as to what's not quite right. They're a pleasant and enjoyable headphone from a tonality point of view. There's really just that very slight lack of naturality with the treble emphasis, but it's very, very minor and very well controlled. Having said that, things don't go so well in terms of what I'd call the technicalities of the headphone. Again, they're not bad, so don't write them off just yet, but I do want to give you a clear picture of what I think they do well and not so well. Moving through some of my test playlist categories, one of the things that I started with was looking at the transients and the sibilance from these. And with the D9200s, what I'd say is that they deliver transients, so the energy at the leading edge of notes, so like that bit of energy around the strum of a guitar, for instance. What they do is they deliver that quite well, but the excess treble can sometimes make them sound just a little bit brittle on that sort of sound. So the guitar strums didn't always feel and sound quite as natural as they should. There was just a little bit too much top end, not enough of the mid-range attack to balance off the treble, and it did make it sound again just a touch artificial. But overall, I'd say the amount of transient, the amount of attack, some could call it the dynamics of the headphone, that sounded really good. In terms of sibilance control, which is somewhat related, they're different but similar, the way these handle those attacking moments in music is really good. They don't get too sibilant, they don't get too harsh, they'll show you if a recording has got too much energy, but they're not going to punish you unfairly. Another element of sound that's somewhat connected to that is the resolution of these, and I'd say that their resolution is very good, And on some tracks it's excellent, but it's not consistent and sometimes it left me a little bit wanting. And I mean wanting for a $1,600 headphone, not wanting in general. And the reason I'm calling that out is that I just found that occasionally, mostly through the mid-range area, I felt like I wasn't able to access everything that was there. It's like things were maybe just a tiny bit congested, not well separated enough. It just made it hard to kind of listen through the music. Some headphones are great at just kind of laying everything out and you can kind of mentally make your way through and pick out different sounds and really understand everything. These don't do that quite so well. And at $1,600 I would like them to. Again, it's not a deal breaker, not a reason to not buy them, but if that's something that's really important to you, these probably aren't a headphone for you. And as you're probably starting to see, there's a bit of a theme here, because something that's then connected to the resolution is how they do soundstage and imaging. And ultimately what you're going to see at the end here is I think there's one issue going on here that has a little bit of a cascading effect. And that is that the soundstage from these is very left-right. It's got good size left and right, but very little depth. So everything feels like it's pushed either left or right or center. There's very little in the middle and very little in terms of depth. And the result of that is that whilst image separation is very good in the left-right plane, when you start to have sounds that are possibly more layered in space rather than left and right, or layered in distance, I should say, than left and right, I started to feel like they were all happening in the same space. And I think that is probably what's contributing to my sense of a lack of resolution. It's hard to hear individual details and textures and layers if everything's on top of itself. And where I think that might be coming from, and this is just me guessing at this point, is that the tuning of these is really unique for a closed back. Having such linear bass and in general such a clean flat response curve from a closed back is very unusual. If you look at many of the closed back headphones, they'll have significant peaks and dips and unusual shaped curves, and that's because they're dealing with the reflections, the resonances of the cup. They haven't got the benefits of open backs where the driver can breathe and not have reflections. And so I wonder if in the efforts to kind of tune these to be so tonally accurate, not that they're perfect, but they're pretty close, I wonder if in their effort to get that really accurate tonal response, if they've actually changed the way the driver's performing and reduced the ability of it to have the soundstage and the imaging and the separation. And again, it's not to say that they're bad in that regard, but they're just very left and right and not a lot of depth, and that can get in the way of imaging sometimes. Or separation at least. Imaging is actually strong, it's the separation of those images that's the problem. And so to sum up the technicalities, these are by no means bad. I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that I don't like them. I think they're a really solid headphone. And in fact, around the price, I think they're a really strong option. But I also think, like most closed backs, that they're also kind of imperfect. They're a little bit flawed, as most closed backs are. It's almost always a compromise when you close in a driver, because you're dealing, as I said before, with resonances, reflections, and there's trade-offs to be had. It's kind of like putting loudspeakers in a really bad room that's maybe a little bit small, and then you have to treat the room so heavily that you're detracting from the optimal performance of the speakers. And so I'll give you some specific track examples in just a moment, but before we get there, two other tests that I did was looking at whether or not these have the ability to rock, as I sometimes call it, or groove. And so I ran through a playlist of tracks designed to test that, and for me, they've got the bass to give you a nice sense of energy and groove in a track. But as is often the case with a tuning like this, the extra treble energy and treble emphasis kind of distracts from the bass and can sometimes get in the way. So I'd say they're decent if you're someone that wants to rock out with a pair of headphones. They're not bad, but they didn't have enough bass to balance the treble in order for me to really feel like I wanted to tap my foot and bob my head. So I'd say they're good, maybe good to average for those that really want to rock out. A little bit more bass would have been helpful, and maybe you can EQ that in if you want to. Changing gears completely and then putting on a classical playlist, I found the D9200s generally pretty good for classical, particularly for closed back. Where they probably fall short is again that staging and imaging. Because they lack the ability to do the layers of sound, I did occasionally feel like things got a bit congested in terms of an orchestral performance. When you have less instruments playing, they're wonderful, but when things get busy, it's hard to separate out what's going on. So your violins can sound like they're sitting in the same space as your woodwinds, which are in the same space as the brass, which are in the same space as the percussion. It's not dreadful, it's not like it makes it a horrible mess as what I just said may have sounded, but it also doesn't give you the ability to separate out and hear the different sections of the orchestra as well. On the flip side of that though, what they do very well for classical is the balance between the bass, the mids and the treble is all fantastic. Classical music tends to respond quite well to the extra little bit of treble that these have. You get that nice sense of attack and texture from things like the strings. But then they've also got the bass extension and linearity so that the full orchestra has presence and body to it. Some headphones can lack that sense of authority with orchestras, but I didn't find the D9200s to have that problem at all. They were really strong in that regard. And so at this point, I felt like the D9200s were a headphone that I liked and I respected, but I didn't quite love. They're enjoyable, they're comfortable, they're easy enough to listen to, but I didn't feel like I was going to be upset to let them go. Before I wrapped everything up though, I wanted to run through 3 tracks because, as I said before, I haven't got a comparison headphone here. And so let me talk through 3 more tracks that you could then go and listen to really get a sense of whether or not the D9200s could be a good fit for you. The first track I wrote notes on was If You Keep Losing Sleep by Silverchair. And the first thing that stood out to me was that the treble emphasis from these just pushed things a little bit too far on things like the snare and the cymbal in the opening of this track. Having said that, when Daniel John's vocals come in, they were really nicely imaged and focused. It was very clear, very natural sounding. And I was also aware that there was buckets of detail coming through. So I talked before about the resolution of these not being top notch, and it's a hard one to actually describe because they do give you lots and lots of detail and resolution. It sounds like it's a really nice responsive driver that's able to keep up with fast movement in the music. And so it's just on some tracks where I think that imaging issue I spoke about, that slight sense of congestion, I think that occasionally gets in the way, but it's all going to depend on the mix. In If You Keep Losing Sleep, it didn't seem to be a problem, and the D9200s handled it beautifully. And so on this track, my only real criticism was that I just felt it leaned a little tiny bit too much into the treble, and I don't think the D9200 needed to. It does have such a sense of kind of clarity and speed from the driver, as in responsiveness, that I think if they'd actually just pulled back on the treble a little bit in the tuning, these could have been a really magic sounding headphone. They may never have given you the soundstage size and layering that I might have liked, but I think tonally they were so close to being pretty special. And as it is, they're good, they're just not exceptional. Moving on to a slightly different sort of track then, I put on You Can't Fool the Fat Man by Randy Newman, and in the opening of this track, the D9200 sounded fantastic. It was just the right mix of instruments that their tonality issues never came up, and they just sounded lovely. I felt like there was probably just still a slightly too much emphasis on the hi-hat, but the way the recording's mixed, it didn't really make it distracting, it was only that I was listening for it. Carrying on through the track, the sound is detailed, it's articulate, but never shouty, never sibilant or harsh, just really well resolved and really clean. Separation from left to right was once again very good, and sounds like the glockenspiel, and overall the orchestra in general all sounded great. So the glockenspiel had this lovely sense of clarity in its first attack of the hit of the glockenspiel, and then the ring of the glockenspiel was beautiful. And then the overall orchestra, as I've already mentioned, had a nice sense of presence and depth to it because of the bass extension and linearity from the D9200s. So here they were sounding great once again, and proving that a lot of this comes down to a track-by-track basis, which is both good and bad. It means that if you happen to listen to the sort of music that suits these, they can sound great. But if you listen to a wide range of genres, sometimes they're going to sound great and sometimes just good. And speaking of that, the final track I listened to was a completely different genre, and specifically it was Good For Nothing by the Hilltop Hoods. Listening to something like hip-hop on these showed me one area that their tuning can go a bit wrong, and that is that when you start to get into something like hip-hop, where you're going to have a bit of extra prominent bass, what tended to happen with the D9200s was the bass from the recording, mixed from the treble from the D9200s, suddenly made a very V-shaped sound, which I'm not necessarily a fan of. If you love that sort of thing, then great, but what it was doing for me was it was meaning that the mid-range was kind of getting lost, because the track was all bass and all treble, a combination of the track, how it was recorded, and the way the D9200s emphasised the treble, and the mid-range kind of got lost in the mix a little bit. And so ultimately I didn't listen to this track for too long on the 9200s because it sounded okay, but not great. These aren't a headphone that I would personally choose for listening to that sort of genre. Anything bass oriented, anything that tilts very much into the bass and then also maybe has treble that's not ideal. Obviously a lot of hip hop and rap might have samples that are old or deliberately grainy. And that combination of bass plus that grainy sort of treble, that's not so good on the D9200s. And so where this left me at the end was really unchanged from what I said before. I think they're a very, very good headphone. I think if you've got a pair of these, you shouldn't feel bad about the purchase. I think they're for the price, for a close back, they're doing a great job, but they also didn't win me over. I don't love them. I'm not going to sit here and recommend them. I actually wish that I still had the Dan Clark Audio Aeon 2 Noirs here because I think it would have been a fascinating comparison. The Noirs off the top of my head are a little bit cheaper. I don't know that they've got quite the dynamics and maybe even the technicalities of the D9200s, but I think tonally and spatially, they might be a little bit better. And so for me, they're probably the two that, off the top of my head, they're the two I would consider if you're in this ballpark for a closed back. I guess maybe you could also throw in something like the Sennheiser HD820 as well, but I don't know that there's necessarily a clear standout. For me, the D9200, if what I've described here suits your tastes, if you're happy with the trade-offs, if maybe the genres you're listening to suit what I've described, then I do think they're a good choice. So as I said, I'm not going to sit here and recommend them, but I'm definitely not going to sit here and recommend against them because I think they're solid. For a closed back, I think they're good, they're comfortable, I think they're beautifully designed, and ultimately, I think it's just some of the trade-offs that might have been made to get them very compact, to get that linear response from a closed back. I think some of those have just robbed them of some magic elsewhere in their tuning. And so as always, I hope you found the video useful and helpful. Hopefully it's clarified my views on these and you can relate to what that will mean for you. Again, I want to say a huge thanks to Kim for lending me his D9200s and making the review possible. And as always, if you have found the video useful, helpful, or interesting, I'd love it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.